Hello, everybody showing up. Yeah, it looks like people are getting here. And I want to make sure it says we are live on Restream. We'll get started in just about 60 seconds. And then I'm going to do a little bit of CXC housekeeping. And then we are going to enjoy a marvelous presentation by Elaine Grogan-Letro. Yeah.
You got it. Perfect.
Okay. Okay. So, screen share. Hello, everybody. Welcome to CXC Day 2. My name is Jersey Drost. I am the Interim Executive Director of Cartoon Crossroads Columbus.org. Thanks so much for being a part of this. And I know after the presentation that Elaine did on the first day that this one is going to be amazing. So this is portfolio careers, which actually the moment I read it, I was like, oh, what a great way to frame up this idea of having other revenue streams. You have a portfolio, of artwork, you have different samples of different things you can do. Your career can also have a portfolio. And I'm so excited to hear how Elaine's going to frame it up and describe it to us. But before we do that, we've got some housekeeping to dive into. So once again, welcome to CXC 2020. This is a presentation followed by Q&A. So there will be some space to answer some questions. I'm going to tell you how you can submit questions in a moment. You have been automatically muted by the host. That's me. And your video is off. This is so that you can participate via text. But, Elaine's got the floor in a moment. And we are recording this and we are streaming it live to various sources like YouTube, Facebook. If you are watching it live outside of the Zoom webinar, you can also chat. I can see it as it comes in, and I will add your questions to the mix. Now, how do you interact in the Zoom webinar? Well, if you can use the chat at the bottom to chat amongst yourselves and also ask questions in a very public way. But if you want to ask a question anonymously or privately, you can use the Q&A box. And when you click on it, this window pops up and there is the option to either send anonymously or you can just type your question and only the presenters, i.e. me and Elaine, will see them. And in the Q&A section, we can talk about them, read from those questions. So please do. Any curiosities, any questions, thoughts, or wonderings. Wonderings don't have to be a question. Wonderings can be like, what about blah, blah, blah? And we can riff on that idea. You don't have to come up with the most ingenious, most elevated, most, mountain trembling, insightful question. It could be just something you're wondering about. And you can type those into the Q&A as well. And so with that, I will stop my screen sharing. And I'm going to hand it over to Elaine. Thank you for being here, Elaine. Everybody give her a warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me, Jersey, and hello to CXC. It is so nice to be with you for another day today. As Jersey said, we've got the Q&A open. I've got my chat window open. So if you want to send a message, I can see that and we can definitely respond to your questions as we're going through this information. As Jersey said, my name's Elaine. It is lovely to meet you. And I have the distinct privilege of getting to work with creative individuals and organizations all across the country, helping with the business side of creativity. Because as we all know, you can master your creativity, but then there are a whole lot of business stuff, whether it's taxes or figuring out how to price your work or knowing how to kind of manage your expenses that really kind of sometimes make or break a creative career. So I get to talk about all of those topics in service of broader creativity. I wanted to acknowledge a couple of ground rules just at the beginning of our time together. We want to make sure we are sharing the floor with respect. That's why we've got the Q&A and the chat. So definitely participate, make your voice heard as you see fit. And I also think it's important to acknowledge that we are all equal parts teachers and learners in this space. So it is possible I will say something and it will really resonate with you and you will say, yes, that's what I want to do. That makes perfect sense. It's also possible that I'll say something and you'll say, you know what, that's not really a good fit for me. That's okay. You are the expert in your own experience, so you get to decide how you apply this information to your own creative career. And lastly, we want to make sure that any stories shared within this space go ahead and stay within this space. This is being recorded, but if someone does share a story, remember that it is their story to share with others. However, definitely take the lesson from that story and carry that lesson with you. So, what are we doing in our time together today? We're going to go over the components of a portfolio career. This is a framework I love to use that, as Jersey said, helps organize income you may have from various sources. We will list some opportunities within each role, and then we'll share some examples of what this looks like in practice. We've also dedicated a little bit of time to talk about some pricing strategies, because as you are thinking about how your revenue falls into these different categories, one of the big challenges is setting appropriate rates. So we'll spend a little bit of time on that. Now, if you were in the webinar yesterday, you know that we spent most of our time talking about the middle column of this worksheet, right? This worksheet is posted on the CXC website. So if you are watching the live stream or if you haven't snagged it yet, feel free to go ahead and download it. It is yours to keep as you see fit. And most of our time today is going to be focused on this right column, the column that says money in. So basically, yesterday, we figured out how much money you really need to make to cover your very real costs as a human, as a creator, and to set aside money for taxes and savings. Today, we figure out how you make that money. So the portfolio career framework is how I like to think about making money. And again, this is just a framework. So it is very possible that you will have income from all of these categories or one category or some combination of them. And that's okay. The entire point of this framework is to enable you to get very clear on your strengths as a creator and as a human, and match those strengths with opportunities to monetize them in a way that makes sense for you. And it should make sense for you financially so that you can make enough money to save and pay taxes and exist as a human and as a creator. But it should also make sense with how you want to spend your time and how you want to spend your energy and contribute to the industry overall. So the first category is your starring role. This is your thing. This is the thing you would do if you could do anything else in the world. And this is the thing you want to make sure to protect kind of at all costs. We want to be really careful about compromising when it comes to our thing. So you can define your thing very, very narrowly or very, very broadly. It's entirely up to you. So maybe you say you are a writer, right? Or maybe you're an illustrator, right? That's a rather broad starring role, but that's perfectly fine. If you were to more narrowly describe your work, you might say you are an illustrator of SpongeBob fan fiction, right? Also fantastic. Slightly more narrow, but still your starring role work, right? So it's up to you to define what this is and how you want to protect it at all costs. The biggest challenge here when it comes to your starring role is making sure you are setting appropriate rates for what it is you are doing. Because it's our starring role, it's the thing we love more than anything else, it's very easy to get pulled in directions where we're maybe not setting appropriate rates for our work or your time. And I have seen individuals who set rates that are way, way, way too high, and also rates that are way, way, way too low. So there's no magic rule about what all artists do. But you want to make sure the rates you are setting for your work or your time are appropriate to you, because it's easy to accidentally devalue this work based on a whole lot of very real circumstances in the world. So make sure within this category, you are saying yes to things on purpose with a clear understanding of what you're getting out of that work. The second category we call supporting cast role categories. Now, you may have noticed that there is a performing arts analogy running through this framework, and that's on purpose. If you have any experience in the performing arts, you know that often there is one person that gets a whole lot of the attention, right? That's the star, the starring role. But there are also other things, often other individuals on stage, that make the star better. They make them shine brighter, they make their performance more effective, right? In the context of your portfolio career, Supporting cast roles are jobs you take that support your starring role in some way. It makes it better. For many individuals, especially in the arts, teaching counts as a supporting cast role, right? It helps establish you as an expert in your field. As you figure out how to master teaching something, that deepens your understanding of it and enables you to do it better in a more competent way. But it also helps build relationships in the field with other educators, with students, with institutions, with organizations that value your association with the institution, right? So there are a lot of intangibles associated with your supporting cast role that supports your starring role. Writing also falls into this category as well. Maybe you find yourself being an illustrator, but you've developed a pretty keen ear for grammar over time. So maybe you pick up some copy editing work, and maybe that helps foster connections with publishers or agents or other platforms where you can foster connections to support your starring role. That's okay. We've also seen, especially in illustration careers, it's possible that you have your starring role work that is illustration related that you really love doing. And then you might have other illustration work that's maybe not exactly what you want to be doing, but you have the technical skills and the expertise to be able to do it very, very well. Maybe you are a graphic novelist and you have a very clear niche that you like to occupy. But maybe you are also very capable of doing medical illustrations. So maybe you pick up freelance medical or textbook illustration work, and that's a supporting cast role for you. You're making use of your same skills, your technique, your expertise, and it's giving you something intangible to support your starring role, in addition to paying you, by the way. But it's also giving you maybe practice with a particular technique, maybe ongoing familiarity with anatomy that can be very helpful as you pursue your illustrations, right? There are other intangibles associated with your supporting cast role work that makes your starring work better. The big challenge when it comes to supporting cast role work, though, is to balance the money you're making from this category against the time you're spending in this category. Many of you, especially if you've got a couple of years under your belt, you may have realized that the opportunities that exist sometimes keep coming and keep coming and keep coming, but they're not exactly what you want to be doing. So you may find yourself spending a whole lot of your time pursuing supporting cast role work, or maybe just saying yes to it if it continues to kind of fall into your lap because you keep doing it well, right? And you might find yourself with no time left to devote to your starring role, right? We want to make sure we're paying close attention to how you're spending your time, especially in this category, because it's really easy to keep saying yes to projects that keep paying the bills. But if your starring role is your thing, we want to make sure you are preserving enough time within your schedule to pursue that really effectively. And by the way, that probably means some marketing and some networking and some administrative work related to your starring role as well. So maybe that means you have a clear idea of what you need to get out of supporting cast role works. Maybe financially is a good way to define that. And then you say yes to enough things to get you to that point. But then you say, no, or not yet, or I can do that in 6 more weeks once you've reached that threshold so that you're still protecting your time a little bit. And this is insanely hard to do, right? Especially during a year when there has been economic uncertainty like there's been in this year. So I'm not saying this is easy at all, but as you start paying attention and having a really clear idea of what you need or want to get out of this category, it makes it a little easier to set some healthy boundaries so that you're still protecting your starring role. The third category is one of my favorites. This is your production assistance work, right? If you've ever been to a live performance back when we had those, you know that a whole lot of things happen behind the scenes, right? There are costumes and sets and stage management and house management and directors and producers and this whole world going on that the audience doesn't even see. But it's vital for the show to continue. In the context of your portfolio career, that's what this production assistance work is. This is the work that is temporary, repeatable, and stable, and you can go back to it when and if you need it to stay in the game. It often has nothing to do with your starring role. All it does is provide financial support to your overall revenue model, and maybe it provides something else that's not at all related to your creativity. Maybe you find yourself picking up administrative work for a certain number of hours a week where you are answering phones and sitting at a desk and doing filing work, right? And you're doing that because having this type of position enables you to have access to health benefits that you might not be able to receive otherwise, or access to more affordable health benefits than you might be able to get from the exchange, depending on what state you live in, right? Or maybe having some kind of stable, predictable work in your schedule enables you to kind of anchor your time in a predictable way. And for some individuals, having that predictable moment in their schedule actually makes their studio time more efficient. So maybe for you, you pick up some production assistance work so that you can have that stability in your schedule because it's good for you overall and it's good for you as a creator, right? The trick when it comes to your production assistance work is for you to know what you are getting out of this experience, right? Because it is really, really easy to fall down a spiral where we think about all the reasons why the arts industry is broken and why production assistance work should even be necessary, right? And those are conversations we can and should be having. But don't let that lens cloud what you are getting out of this experience. Because if you know why you're taking on a particular job or a particular role, it's easier for you to reconcile that with your overall income pick. And that's okay. As long as you are pursuing work and accepting it on purpose, right? Then you still retain control. So, key things to pay attention to as we're thinking about this framework are, what are you earning from each of these categories? How much time are you spending in each of these categories? And what is your goal? For some individuals, the goal is to make all of their money from starring role work and spend all of their time in starring role work. And that's okay. But for many other individuals I work with, they enjoy having a mix of different things, especially starring role and supporting cast role work, because it kind of stretches your brain in different directions and it provides some ongoing creative stimulation. So understand where you are, what your ideal is, and then what do you do with that information? You use it to start making intentional choices about what you say yes to and what things you pursue, or what steps you can take to grow the income from your starring role work, for example. You do have the capability to make these choices and make the numbers work. And sometimes it feels like it should be easier, but this is something that you are fully capable of doing. There's a question in the Q&A that says, what's a job example of production assistant work? Great question. I have heard so many different examples. This is actually my favorite category to share examples for. Service industry jobs. So, bartending, waiting tables, those kind of things certainly fall in this category. I worked with an actor in New York once who kept working at Chipotle because he swore it was the best character study work he had ever done. And it was a really easy job for him to pick up between productions. He was a theater actor and doing pretty well, but he still kind of needed the cash flow from picking up some hours at Chipotle here and there. So those are good examples. I would also say, if you're working maybe in a law firm or an accounting firm in some sort of temp role, that could fall into this category. Babysitting and dog walking falls into this category. I've worked with individuals who worked construction or landscape work, particularly during certain months, or cleaning houses. I had one illustrator once who was a third shift security guard as a production assistant job, right? So there are lots and lots and lots of different examples that could fall into this. And I imagine many of you have pretty great stories of production assistance jobs you've had over time. So thinking about which of these you could tap into or you could go back to if you needed something from them at a particular moment in time would be really helpful. There's another point in the chat that I think is a really good one from Jersey. Jersey mentions it sounds like doing some journaling or capturing of experiences can really help here. Absolutely. That is very, very true. There's a little worksheet you can screen grab at the end that'll be sort of a brainstorming jumping off point. But even just paying attention on over a couple weeks maybe, and just jotting down how you feel when you're doing certain types of projects or jobs could be an interesting way to hone in on maybe what you really, really like. Or as you start thinking about it, you might be totally clear on what you like and what you don't like doing. So one of the questions that comes up is, again, how do you balance diversifying your income with being pulled in too many directions? And I want to hit this point again because it really is a struggle that many creative individuals face. My advice is to pay really close attention to the time and money trade-off, right? In a perfect world, you might make a lot of money from supporting casserole jobs without spending a lot of time in them. But that's not always the case, especially for instructors. And to be clear, illustrators who also teach might find themselves having two starring roles, one with teaching and one with illustration. And that's okay. You're allowed to redo this framework in whatever way works for you. But you do want to make sure you're setting healthy boundaries when it comes to your time around other things you're doing, because it's really easy to pour your whole heart into something, but that means you're not pouring your whole heart into something else. Because after all, every yes is a no to something else, whether it is sleep or self-care or creative work. So just keep those things in mind as you go through. Someone shared in the chat, Mandy said they struggle with guilt around having a stable production assistance job they hated for years, but there's no shame in it. And I love that point. Mandy, thank you for sharing that, because there absolutely is no shame in that at all. The trick is to understand exactly what you're getting out of it. And if you're getting out of it the freedom to pursue your work in whatever way you want to pursue it without having to compromise your starring role work, that's pretty powerful. In fact, that comment made me think about another example of production assistance work that often comes up. Real estate comes up as a really interesting production assistance work here and there. We see this a lot in major metropolitan areas. So I worked with a lot of writers in New York, and a lot of writers sort of moonlight as real estate agents or brokers, right? Because again, it's flexible. They can pick up the hours when things are going slow. And, you know, it's not a terrible source of income, right? Also, if you are someone who maybe has won a large award, or you have been able to accumulate some amount of income or savings over time, a whole lot of people will try to purchase real estate and then rent it out. And that provides some ongoing rental income that's not at all related to your creativity, but it kind of helps you pay the bills while you're pursuing starring role work. And that is perfectly fine. So within these categories, especially within starring role and supporting cast role work, when you can control it, how can you make sure you're setting appropriate rates for your work or your time? When I think about pricing strategies, which is essentially what we're talking about here, I like to think of them as having 4 different components that inform the price. And there is not a magical answer to, you know, how much of each component influences the price. But I think it's really important to understand that all 4 of these things affect the price for your work or your time to a certain degree. So let's start with costs. If you were in the workshop yesterday, we spent a whole lot of time on costs. Why? Because they help inform your pricing strategy. They don't capture any value, right? But they essentially make sure that you are covering all of your costs so that your business is not losing money, or so that you as a human are not losing money while you're also saving and paying your taxes. So starting with costs is really, really important, right? You need to be informed about your costs. And if you Google, how should I price my work? You'll get some sort of formula that probably looks something like this. This example is figuring out the hourly rate for your work, but you could also use this example with a different denominator. So you could take your costs not divided by billable hours, but divided by, say, works you hope to sell. And then you would get an average price per work, right? But for purposes of this example, we're looking at our costs and we're looking at our time, and we're using those things to figure out our hourly rate. So you would start by brainstorming all of your costs. You probably have more costs than you think, so spend some time making sure this number is right. And then we think about how many hours a client would reasonably pay you for. And this differs based on the type of project you're doing. Some clients very happily pay for research time. If your work has a graphic design bend to it or a graphic design feel, there's probably research time baked into most of your contracts, right? But if it's not, your research time might be your own time. That doesn't mean you still won't get paid for it. It just means you wouldn't count those hours in this formula, because we want to make sure the hourly rate is capturing those hours. If you spend time teaching or pursuing residencies or working another job or caring for family members or anything else you might do as a human, that affects your billable hours as well. And this is another moment where journaling or tracking your time can be really helpful in helping you identify how many hours a client will reasonably pay you for during a week or during a month, depending on what time frame you want to look at. So in this example, this person has $5,000 of costs per month. They're planning on supporting themselves entirely from their creative work, which is why personal costs are in here as well. And then they have studio costs, taxes, and saving. So that gets them to $5,000 a month. They are estimating that their billable hours will be 25 hours a week or 48 weeks per year. So that's 1,200 hours per year. So if we add that information into our formula, we take $5,000 times 12 months, because there are 12 months in a year, divided by 1,200 hours per year, and that gives us an hourly rate of $50, right? That is just a starting point for how you might use this formula to set a rate for your work or your time. It's a starting point because there are a whole lot of problems if you're only using a formula. The biggest problem is probably that it only works if your assumptions are right. If you end up working fewer hours for any number of valid reasons, or if your costs are higher, right, all of a sudden your formula is broken and it's very hard to change your hourly rate once you've already committed to it for a client, right? It's not impossible to change your hourly rate, right, or to change your rates overall. But generally, existing clients like a little bit of a heads up, and we often tie rate changes to seasonal changes or the start of a new year, right? Because there's a very natural rhythm there to when we can communicate as individuals are planning that the rates will be higher going forward, right? The other issue with using a formula is that it completely ignores everything else that is going on around you. It doesn't acknowledge who your customers are, what they're willing and able to pay, or what your competitors are charging. So if you are someone that is able to have remarkably low costs, right? Essentially, using this formula guarantees that you pass those cost savings onto your customers. And that might be very nice, but what if you have very low costs because of your own skills and expertise? Shouldn't you have the reward for that rather than passing that on to your customers? That's something to think about. This formula is built and driven by cost, right? And I would argue that that's maybe not the best driver of setting your rates. It doesn't work if you're really good at something, right? I have zero Photoshop editing skills, right? Or any Adobe skills at all. That's not my strong suit, but I'm really good at Excel, right? So if someone were to hire me to do something in Excel, and it might take an illustrator 6 hours to do it, if I can do it in 30 minutes, right? And we have the same costs, all of a sudden I'm making a lot less for that project, even though I can do it much faster. I should be the one benefiting from all those years of building up Excel skills. And you should be the one benefiting from all the investment you've made in becoming really good at your creativity. Having an hourly rate also opens you up to some silly arguments with clients. Things like, why did that take you so long to do, for example, right? When the clients really don't have a whole lot of insight into the process that goes into something. So my advice would be, go through this process, get a sense of what your costs are, and maybe shake out a formula just so that you can be informed. But this should not be the main driver of something. You also need to think about your customers. Who do you serve? What do they value about what you provide? And what are they willing and able to pay? And both of those things are important. Your customers have to be both willing to pay for something and able to pay for something, right? So this actually ties into a question that Kevin put in the chat. Kevin shares, can someone monetize working for free? For example, you create a webcomic without having income, you perform volunteer illustrations, you do unpaid writing book reviews, or does working for free end up hurting you? I think this is interesting because no, I don't think working for free hurts you. I think there is a moment where it can be bad for the industry, right? You think about a site like Fiverr, which could be a great source for supporting pastoral work if it makes sense for you, but it also enables someone who might be less willing to pay a true rate for something to pay less. So is that bad overall? Well, maybe, right? Many of our photographer friends would argue that it's been real challenging with everybody becoming a photographer lately, right? And that's a valid conversation to have. But if you hone in on who your customers are and you identify the ones that are both willing and able to pay for your work, that means they're valuing what you're doing and they have the ability to pay for it. And maybe they're valuing your technical expertise. Maybe they're valuing the personal connection you have with them. Maybe they're valuing the characters you create, right? There could be any number of things they're valuing, and finding them and connecting with them is a good strategy in general. But sometimes those we want to serve are not able to serve. Or are not able to pay for what we provide. Now, that doesn't mean we shouldn't provide things for them. It just means we might need to find a different indirect customer. So this is where identifying grants or ways of subsidizing your work, or maybe drawing on some of those supporting cast roles to subsidize your work that you're doing for free or on a pro bono basis or at less than market value can make sense, right? And that's an okay approach as long as you're kind of paying attention to it. It's also worth pointing out that sometimes if you're doing work for free or at below market value, it's okay to get something intangible out of it as well. Maybe, Kevin, you've been asked to donate work to a local humane society for them to auction off in support of their pets or something like that, right? Maybe they're doing a fundraiser to raise money to buy dog food for the puppies and kittens that they're trying to find homes for. And maybe you love the Humane Society, and so you want to support them. So you say, yeah, I will certainly contribute a piece to your auction, which would be very nice of you, right? Now, there's no immediate way to monetize that, right? Because you are giving them something, you get a tax write-off for the cost, not the fair value, by the way, and then they auction it off. But what if you say, could I attend the event and maybe chit chat with some of the donors who are there, or the board members, or other individuals that I might be able to connect with and then grow my potential customer base from, That could be one option. And maybe you ask for at least 2 tickets so you can bring someone with you and someone can take some images of you and you can have some marketing collateral to use, right? That could be an option. But then you could go one step further and say, could I please have a list of everyone who bids on my work? That way, you could reach out to them afterwards and say something like, thank you so much for bidding on the illustration of the adorable puppy I did. I'm sorry you didn't win. Would you like to see some of my other work or do a studio visit or something like that, right? So you can use your creativity to think about stretching these experiences into the next thing, right? And getting as much sort of traction from each experience as possible. And that all comes down to identifying who you serve and what they are willing and able to pay, and then figuring out if you need additional indirect customers or some other strategy to kind of make it work. Competitors are the third category, right? So it's important that you have an understanding of who else is doing what you're doing and what the financial landscape for those individuals look like. I did a workshop a number of years ago in New York for a modern dance company. And I asked the question, who are your competitors? Who else is doing what you are doing? And very honestly and delightfully, they said, no one. We have no competitors. No one else is doing what we are doing. And in a literal sense, that was true, right? No one else was doing the exact type of work they were doing. But that didn't mean they didn't have any competitors. So I asked the question differently. I said, okay, it's 8 o'clock on a Friday night and I could come see your show. What could I go do instead? And we started brainstorming. I could go see a different dance company perform. Maybe I love dance and I could see modern dance or I could see something classical, right? As someone who loves dance, that might be a viable trade-off. Or I could go see any other live artistic experience. I could go to the theater, I could go to a jazz club, I could go to the symphony, right? There are other live artistic experiences I could have had at 8 o'clock on a Friday night. Or I could have gone to a baseball game. Maybe I just like being around people who enjoy something that I enjoy. I value the community of the gathering. So I could go to a live event that was not necessarily arts related. Or I could stay home and watch Netflix because it may have been a rough week. My childcare options may have fallen through. It could be raining. It might be too challenging to get to the theater. There are any number of reasons why I might view Netflix as a viable alternative to a modern dance performance on a Friday night, right? Now, that's a tough sentence to say out loud and to hear, especially if you are the modern dance director. But it's important to understand that there are different customers who value different things about what you provide. And those customers perceive your competitors differently than you may perceive your competitors. So if we were to adapt this to a comics or graphic design and illustration narrative, right, we would think about an illustrator, maybe falling in that core center, and maybe you're competing against any other illustrators. Maybe they have different styles than you or different genres than you, or maybe they reach a slightly different audience or tackle a different subject matter in what they do. And then we might look at all other 2D illustrators, right? Or 2D artists. So if I were to hang a piece of yours on my wall, I could also hang a photograph or a painting or something else, some sort of mixed media piece, right? Or we expand even further to lots of freely available content online, right? That I could dip into via YouTube or Instagram or any of these other options. So as you continue to expand the circles out, it becomes abundantly clear that your competitors might not be who you think they are, but it's important to understand who your customers perceive as your competitors so that you can help distinguish yourself from them. So that for the person that would rather watch Netflix than go to see a modern dance performance, you can say, you know what? I bet you didn't realize how amazingly cool some of the storylines are in this performance. Could I tell you more about that? Or something like that, right? So you can continue to have conversations with customers and highlight what they value about what you do. The fourth, so as we're thinking about your competition, competition is a really good thing. I see this especially in the illustration community. The support that illustrators provide each other through online forums and feedback for work and recommending each other for different projects is huge. And this active participation in the community is actually a really, really good thing for the industry overall. And it helps you get a lot of insights into what others are charging for their work, how they're charging for their work. Are they using an hourly rate, or are they measuring linear inches, or doing some other approach? And they're a great resource to have these candid conversations about the value we're providing. So embrace your competitors and make sure you're clear on how you are both similar and different from them. And that's a good thing. The fourth component are your competencies. What are the things that make you the most special, capable person of doing what you are doing? Your competencies are the unique skills, experiences, and perspectives that you bring to your craft. They can be professional, they can be personal. Maybe you always show up on time, or you always deliver work on time, right? Those are personal strengths. Maybe you have technical strengths. Maybe you are particularly good at a technical aspect of your craft, and that's something that really adds a lot of value. Maybe you have a unique perspective based on your life experiences, based on your point of view, based on who you are or where you live. Or maybe you've had unique experiences that find their way into your creativity that really, really add value to your work and what you do. And probably you have a few of all of these. This is a yes and all of the above kind of situation. So as you start drafting these and figuring out what they are and really honing in on what your competencies are, this becomes a list of how you are really adding value to your work. And really, that's what we're talking about. As we're talking about setting your prices, which are informed by your costs, what your customers are willing and able to pay, what your competitors are charging, and also what your unique strengths, skills, and competencies are. What we're really talking about is capturing the value of your work, right? We express that in terms of prices often, but what we're really doing is capturing the value of your work. And the value of your work is way more than the costs of your materials or the cost of your equipment or the cost of your supplies. It's so much more than that. And by considering these other factors, it's easier to hone in on what that value is, to place it in context, and to be able to explain it to someone when they say something like, oh, I was also talking to so-and-so and they quoted me a much lower price than you did. You can certainly then respond to why your price is different. I suspect as you go through these conversations, you'll also find some phrases or verbiage that can serve you well. So saying something like, normally I would charge $800 for something like this. Does that work within your budget? That draws upon a price anchoring strategy where you can set the expectation of what is normal for something like what they're describing, and then you can open up the conversation for negotiation if that does or doesn't fit within their budget. You can also make use of a range pricing strategy where you say something like, the commission you're describing would normally cost between $500 and $1,200. Where do you see yourself falling within that range? And then you can adjust accordingly. You can also think about having different things at different price points, which is something illustrators and graphic designers and graphic novelists do really, really well. The idea of having an original work and some prints and some stickers and maybe a digital download, right? There are a lot of different components of things you can monetize so that you can make your work available at different price points to different customers. And that also sort of builds on a price anchoring strategy where you set the expectation for the high dollar item, the original, if you will, and then there are other alternatives that seem much more reasonable by comparison. So what does this look like in practice? Here's an example. This is an example of an artist whose overhead is $750 a month. It costs them about $50 to make each piece, and they sell about 3 pieces per month. Or sorry, they make 3 pieces per month. So if we were to start with the cost component, we would take 3 pieces a month times 12 months. That's 36 pieces a year. Each one is $50. That's $1,800 in direct costs to make the work. And then their overhead costs total $9,000 a year, $750 a month for 12 months. That ends up being $10,800 per year. If we divide that, not by hours, but by the number of works they've created, that gives us a cost per piece of $300. I would call that maybe a break-even point or a absolute minimum price they would charge. But very often, this is where artists stop. And they say, oh, great. Okay, I'll price each one at $300. But that doesn't include any of those other things. So maybe you step back and you say, okay, how do I sell these works? Who are my customers? And maybe they are high-end illustrations that appeal to a niche audience, right? You're making direct sales to the consumer through some high-end markets. And maybe you pick up some commissions as well. Those you're serving love your genre. They are super into it, and they're not necessarily price sensitive. They also value that what they're getting is something very, very unique because it's not something they could purchase at any sort of big box retailer, right? And they value supporting you, the human. This is basically the ideal customer, right? When we look at the competitors from this customer's point of view, they might also think about hiring portrait artists or hiring photographers for high-end work or shopping for art through galleries, all of which would probably command a much higher price point than $300 a piece. So we do some research into what reasonable prices for those types of work is, and then we adjust our selling price. It was $300. Now we're saying, okay, we can be a little bit higher. We can be at the high end of maybe a photographer kind of rate. So $2,500 feels slightly more reasonable. But then you think about all the extras that you put into the piece, the personalization that you do in having conversations with someone who's maybe commissioning something, or the fact that you put together a process book of your creation and maybe turn that into something they can sell or share digitally, or something they can put on a coffee table in front of the work so that they can share more about it with people that might come see it. Or maybe you add a meet a collector kind of interview series because your customers really value that personal connection and feeling like they're part of the collectors of your work, right? So once you add in all these extra intangibles that do, by the way, cost money and time and energy, the real value of what you're providing is way more than $300. Maybe you decide it's much closer to about $4,500. That means if your costs were right, and I'm suspicious that the original costs may have been on the low side, but if your costs were right, now you don't have to sell all 36 pieces at $300. You need to sell 3 at around $4,500, and it changes your break-even point completely. There's a question in the Q&A. If you are consistently getting lower price jobs, would it be good to stop for a moment and reevaluate or to seek a higher price job? Yes, absolutely. And I say this not to, belittle the lower price jobs, right? Because there is a fantastic strategy where you can do a whole lot of lower price jobs and make as much as if you did fewer higher price jobs. So if you are looking at your pricing strategy and looking at who you're serving, right, you may have fallen into a niche where you are serving customers who are less willing or able to pay more. And that's okay, right? But if you really do the math and figure out how many of those jobs or projects do you need to do to meet your revenue goal, you might realize that there's just not enough time in the year for you to do as many as you would need to do at that rate to make what you need to make to cover all of your costs. So you could pause, step back, reevaluate, or you could just kind of slow the inflow from those kind of jobs as you start pursuing other types of things in parallel. Maybe that means reaching out to other types of customers, or maybe it means partnering with others who are reaching maybe a higher end market and figuring out how you can sort of be part of those conversations as well. Maybe it means exploring different geographical markets. Maybe your work really resonates with people in South Florida, right? And maybe that's an area where you can do some real targeted marketing and forge some partnerships there. So you could target a different geographic area that might be more comfortable paying a higher price for your work as well. So it is possible to just step back, pause, and totally reevaluate. Or you could just kind of slow the lower price jobs, maybe push them further out into the future, maybe commit to doing, one a week, or maybe spending 5 hours per week on it, whatever sort of makes sense in terms of your schedule. And then when a new one comes in, you can say, yes, I'd love to do that. Now I'm scheduling out into the middle of November. Does that timing work for you? And many clients will probably say yes. And essentially, you're still collecting that money. You're just collecting it later, giving you some breathing room to pursue some different things right now. So what does this look like in action? Here are some examples of real humans I have worked with who have put this into action in different ways. I've changed some of the facts so the real humans aren't identifiable. But a literary artist does great speculative fan fiction work. She's got a really strong online following. So she self-publishes her work and she draws on Patreon and Kickstarter to essentially pre-sell works that she's going to self-publish, right? Kind of an example of monetizing something that would otherwise be free through Patreon or Kickstarter, right? Building up those communities and then activating them for some sort of transaction. And it's not tricking them into supporting you because you've built that support, right? So that's a great starring role kind of strategy. But then she also tutors high schoolers on the SAT and ACT. And when things are really slow, as they have been for her this year, she picks up freelance copy editing work for a friend of hers who works for a publisher, right? So it's not all exactly related to what she does, but in total, it makes everything work. A visual artist might create large public works that is funded primarily through grants and private contributions. And this person maintains a full-time teaching job to provide stable access to income when the grants maybe aren't as predictable, and to have access to research and publication that helps support and inform his work. And then the third example is graphic designer who does amazing typography work. They generally get commissions through Instagram and by sort of very clearly targeted things they're putting on Instagram. They're really, really effective at using this channel, but that's not always stable and predictable. So they do web design and logo work on a freelance basis for various musical groups, and that works for them. They also pick up retail jobs when they really need to, but they haven't had to do that for a number of years. Okay, there's a question in the chat. Kevin shares that the pricing example seemed unrealistic because $4,500 for a commissioned piece didn't feel like it was relevant. And that's okay. The example wasn't meant to tell you to start charging $4,500 for your work, but rather to illustrate how the starting price calculated just in costs isn't necessarily reflective of what the real value of something could be. So maybe the real value, if you're going through this exercise and thinking about the competencies and the competitors and the customer's perspective, maybe you reach a conclusion that's closer to, say, $800 or $1,200, right? You're still coming out way ahead by capturing the value of what you're providing rather than letting costs drive it. So that's a great clarification, Kevin. This is the screen grab moment of the day. This is a worksheet that I sometimes hand out that looks like sort of a brainstorming jumping off point. So as you start thinking about how you're spending your time, how you're earning your money, you can start thinking about the types of work you might have that fall into these different categories. And you can compare what your ideal looks like and what your current reality looks like. And again, you might be someone who says, you know what, my ideal scenario is starring role work and production assistance work. because anytime I do something that's related to my work, but not my work exactly, I'm not interested in doing my starring role work. I'm too tired, I'm too drained, I'm not in a good place to do it. So your ideal might be starring and production assistance work. Or maybe you say, you know what, I kind of like the idea of doing a lot of different things within this industry. So I'm going to focus on starring role and supporting cast role work. That is perfectly fine and totally okay. You get to decide where your time is best spent and where your dollars are best earned, and then take some tangible steps to move in that direction. So if you want some homework or some next steps to take some of this conversation and apply it to your own life or career or practice, start the brainstorm. Maybe start journaling, as Jersey suggested. There's a lot of good time for reflection on how you're spending your time and how you're earning your money. And remember that you do have it within your power to identify how you want to spend your time and to capture the real value of what you're doing. You don't always have full control over what you're charging, right? Especially if maybe you are already in a contract with an agent or a publisher, or maybe some of your writing or creation works are governed by union contracts. You might not have full control over capturing that value, but in some instances you do. And to the extent that you can make sure you really are capturing it, that's a really good thing to do. And you can list your own 3 next steps to get you closer to your ideal. So that's our recap for the day. We identified the components of a portfolio career. You had the starring role, the main thing you like to do, your supporting cast roles, which are anything related to your starring role, but not exactly the same thing. And then we had production assistance work, which is unrelated to your starring role, but often keeps you in the game to live to fight another day. We listed some opportunities and shared some examples of different works or roles that can fall within those different categories. And then we spent some time going through a more holistic pricing strategy so that you can think about capturing the real value of what you do rather than letting your costs or what other people are charging dictate what you charge as well. We do have a couple of moments left for questions. I think I saw another one. Mandy had shared in the chat in response to an earlier comment that thinking about if you're producing something for free, is there a way to kind of monetize that? And Mandy had shared that blending free content to draw an audience and then sell them other offerings, almost like a freemium kind of model, could be a really good option. Mandy suggests e-courses, books of the comics you've posted, et cetera, et cetera. This is a great, great strategy, right? Because essentially what you're doing is sharing your work in an effort to build an audience and then encourage the audience to take action to support you financially, whether it's through Patreon or a membership model or ongoing subscriptions, or it's supporting a campaign to publish something or produce something you might be doing, or even just to say, hey, thanks for supporting me. Here's a form to pre-order my next thing or something like that, right? So there are great ways to kind of think about doing that. I would make sure, though, the key part in that is that you are capturing the information of the people who are interested, right? Because oftentimes we share things and we feel great about sharing them and people say nice things. But there's often a big disconnect between people who say nice things and then people who part with their money. So you want to make sure you're collecting all the information so that you can stay in touch with those individuals and get a clearer sense about what they value. And Mandy's underscoring that point. An email list is a great way to do that. Targeted ads via social media are not a terrible way to do that. Creepier for sure, but an email list enables you to kind of push content towards the people who are already supporting you. What other questions do we have? We have about 1.5 minutes left. Jersey, did I miss any questions, or were there other questions that came through the other channels?
We got another one that just came in. So there you go.
Wonderful. Okay, Annie shares from yesterday with the SEP and the simple retirement plans. What happens if you have to go back to a W-2 job or a contracting job? Will you still maintain your account? Annie, genius question. Yesterday, we talked about if you are self-employed, you can contribute to a SEP and a simplified employee pension or a simple IRA. Turns out you still totally and completely control that money. Now, you can't take that money out of the account without facing a penalty, but once you've contributed it, it is yours, it is fully vested, and it hangs out with you until you're ready to draw upon it in retirement, even if you pick up additional W-2 jobs. So that's a great, great question, Annie. And the same is true, by the way, for just a regular old individual retirement account, an IRA, you might contribute to. You still always have that money, even if you start earning money from other sources. And someone else asked for the worksheet to be shared. Yes, I think the link might be in the chat.
I shared the big worksheet with the 3 columns, but I don't know if they're asking for the worksheet that you showed at the very end of this presentation with the 3.
Oh, the screen grab worksheet. Good question. I don't know either. So I'm going to hang out on this slide in case you want to screen grab it. And Jersey, how about I email you the PDF of this afterwards, and maybe you could post it.
That'd be great. I should also say, I feel like it's worth mentioning that if you go to minervafinancialarts.com, you can follow up with Elaine. Elaine has a book that you wrote about these topics called Arts and Numbers, which you can avail yourself of, but you also do small group training and creative coaching. So if you want some one-on-one, guidance from Elaine, and I would highly recommend it, you can find out more at minervafinancialarts.com.
Thanks, Jersey. I appreciate that.
Well, I mean, thank you for, showing up here and just giving us 2 really dynamite presentations. The one thing, if I could just take one more minute to clarify, because when you talk about journaling, I feel like that's something that is a fairly abstract topic to artists, because a lot of what we do when we're developing our skills becomes an intuition, right? And when there's an old TV show called Home Movies with H. John Benjamin, and a kid goes to this awesome guitarist. He's like, "How do you play guitar?" He's like this. He goes, does all this finger tapping, and there's a truth to that, right? Because that is how you do it. But what they're really asking is, what are all the steps I need to go through in order to be able to achieve that mastery? And not everybody is awesome at unpacking that, because you're just so in the moment doing it. So when we talk about journaling, I'm wondering if you could just kind of give a broad sense of what kinds of things am I capturing when I'm journaling?
Yeah. Oh, what a great question. So I will say periodically, we do have a monthly newsletter, and sometimes it will include journal prompts that kind of tie into whatever topic we're talking about. I think the last one that had that may have been September or August. This month, we're talking about investments and the market, and no one wants to journal about that. But I would say I like the idea of thinking about sort of specific things you want to pay attention to. So if you were to start journaling around kind of your time and your money, a question that I might pose is maybe once a week, say, what was the best I felt when I was doing work this week? And then journal about what that felt like or looked like. And then as you kind of dig into that a little bit more, you can say, okay, was that starring role work, or was that supporting cast role work? And maybe it was supporting cast role work because you were working with these amazing humans, or there were really great elements about it, right? So that's kind of where I would start. The second question might be, this year or this month, I was proudest about ... And then thinking about what project you earned money from, or what money you earned that you were most proud of. Was it someone who had been following you on Instagram for 3 years and finally made a purchase? Or was it a client you'd been going back and forth with for, months and months and months, and they finally did something? What were you kind of most proud of in terms of earning your money? And then maybe dig into that a little bit. So those might be 2 prompts I might suggest to get you started.
I think that's great. And if I could, to the artists watching, I've been journaling actually for 8 years. Oh, where did my screen go? Can you see me?
You're a little frozen, and it looks like there's a ghost website there too.
Yeah. It was trying to share your screen. Well, my OBS just decided that it wants to conk out. So I guess you could get like just graph composition books. I carry one with me all the time to capture those ideas. So
Totally. Austin Kleon's newsletter and work, Steal Like an Artist, is also a great starting journaling practice resource.
Super cool. Elaine, thank you so much for spending so much time with us and for all of the great insights that you brought to CXC 2020. If everybody could give Elaine a round of applause, that would be, I think she deserves it. And thanks to everybody who's participating in CXC 2020. There is more stuff coming up in, about a half hour. So keep checking in on the feed and we'll see you in the Discord. Thanks, Elaine.
My